Hello. Welcome to the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show.
Welcome to a podcast show about stuff. It's the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Here's your host, Stephen Davis.
Welcome to another marvelous episode of the show about stuff, the Stephen Davis Show. Today, my guests are the fabulous Thomas sisters. Catherine, a civil rights lawyer and a real estate agent, and her sister, Claudia, the very first Black woman orthopedic surgeon in these United States. It's going to be a must-see episode. So, hold on to your hats. Here we go. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, how are you all doing today? I hope you have had a wonderful time.
Yes, we've had a wonderful time getting ready for this momentous occasion, a podcast with I don't want to say infamous Stephen Davis,
Oh,
but the
please don't.
famous, at least famous Stephen Davis. Thank you
Oh,
for the invitation.
thank you for so much for accepting it. And I'm only famous in my mind. Now, how we usually start off these broadcasts is we go all the way back to where were you all born? First of all, who is the older sister?
I am
Oh, you claim that? Okay. And where were you born at?
Brooklyn Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. Our first home, I remembered suddenly the other day, was on Lafayette Avenue.
Oh, I was born in Manhattan, but when I moved to Brooklyn a long time ago, I have claimed Brooklyn to be the center of the universe. So I am glad that you were born in Brooklyn. And I don't live very far from Lafayette Avenue either, maybe 5 minutes away. And Claudia, where were you born at?
Hospital, Brooklyn Hospital, same thing.
Brooklyn
15 months
Hospital.
after my sister. Yes.
Okay, all right. And what do you remember about the early years about growing up in Brooklyn?
As far as I'm concerned, I don't remember anything because we moved to Queens before I had memory or
Okay.
lasting memory. I don't remember Brooklyn as our home. Our real home as children was in Queens, Jamaica, Queens. Same Jamaica as in Jamaica Funk. That is our neighborhood. And that's where we grew up.
I actually had my grandmother's sister lived in Jamaica. My grandmother lived in Harlem and with my grandfather and aunts and folks, but I remember traveling over. It was a big trip going over the bridge and going to Jamaica because all of a sudden you went from all of these big buildings to these houses. And then it was a wonderful time. Now, what about you, Catherine? What do you remember from your Brooklyn days? Very little also?
very little, although I think that a picture taken of me, which Claudia so lovingly had enlarged of me with my little naked behind showing on a couch. I'm pretty sure that was taken in Brooklyn because I was a baby, young enough to not have moved. I think we moved to Queens when I was about 2.5.
2.5. Uh,
So
you
that's all
may
I
jog
remember
my
about.
memory.
I remember where we lived, how it was laid out, but that's about it.
Tell me, since that was the beginning, let's talk about your parents. First of all, your mother first, since ladies first. What are your memories, Catherine?
Our mother was always very protective and loving and an educator. Our first teacher, and a good one at that. We learned to read. I won't say write, that might be an exaggeration, but we certainly learned to read long before it was time to go to elementary school. And in part, the reason we moved where we did in Queens was that there was an elementary school right across the street. And I think our mother saw that as an opportunity for us to get a good education. Claudia?
And you, Claudia?
This is my autobiography. I hope the
Uh-huh.
letters are not backwards as they are in my screen.
Oh,
But
No, they look
God's
good.
Spare Life is an autobiography that was published in 2007. My first memories, as I document in this book, were of Kathy and I sitting around the 1950s Art Deco red faux marble kitchen table with the chrome edging and the chairs with the red velvet, not velvet, but plastic, really,
Plastic,
vinyl
yep.
seats with the chrome molding around that, the chrome back, with mommy instructing us in language and arithmetic because these are things that she didn't learn easily. Our mother was dyslexic.
mhm.
There was no definition for dyslexia for people born in 1923. So she was just considered dumb. She failed the second grade twice and was determined that her children would grow up with a better education than she. So when we were maybe 3 years old, Kathy a little older than I, we sat at that kitchen table and our mother taught us that you can draw any letter with a line and a circle. So she taught us, she did teach us to write and to know our alphabet, to draw our letters, and to read. She also taught us diction and taught us how to compute addition by having a little scale that she got somewhere, a little plastic scale. And if you hung a 7 on this side and hung a 3 and a 4 on that side, the scale would balance. So we learned 3 plus 4 is 7. We
Very ingenious.
learned that 2 plus 2 is 4. She was determined to have us be educated young ladies. And this was my father's dream as well.
Where's your mother from?
Pascagoula, Mississippi, on the Gulf of Mexico, as I say, as far south as down south goes. That's where she was from, she and her siblings.
And how did she get to New York?
On the U.S. New Orleans, I believe it was a steamship.
Oh, she took a steamship from Mississippi all the way up to New York?
That's right. She and her aunt, our grandmother's sister, took the children. There were 2 boys and 2 girls, and each of them took 2 children on the boat. And if I can tell it, this was after their father sold the cow, the milk cow, to buy a Georgette blouse. Georgette is like silk for his girlfriend. And our grandmother, whom we lovingly called Minimo, had enough at that point. And she left us behind, excuse my French, and went up to New York, where one of her uncles had settled, which was in Brooklyn on Quincy Street, 101 Quincy Street.
Oh, Quincy Street, right down the street from me. All of these landmarks that are still here and still live around. Catherine, what was your recollection of your father?
To us at that age, he seemed bigger than life. Wouldn't you say, Claudia?
Yes.
Although once we grew up, he wasn't that big of a man, but as a young man, he was a strapping image of manhood, handsome, with curly hair. And back in the day, things like that seemed to matter. He didn't do a lot of talking, but he was always very jovial. People liked to be around him because he would tell jokes and always be ready to laugh and have a good time. to play cards and we did family types of activity. He spent many hours working, and for that we are eternally grateful because that allowed our mother to be a housewife. And back when we were growing up, a housewife was a waning title to have. Most of your wives had to go to work eventually, even though the children were school-age children. So his hard work and his adventure, not adventure, but entrepreneurial spirit allowed us to lead a comfortable life. People used to think we were rich because of that, and also because our mother was a professional seamstress and made our matching outfits, which today she would be called a designer. So between us having these matching fabulously crafted outfits and our father being the sole breadwinner, we were considered to be a cut above the others. But we didn't act like it, nor were we treated that way by our parents. Yes, we had to toe the line in terms of doing our schoolwork. We knew that was our job all through elementary school. Our job was to do our schoolwork. We didn't really have to do a lot of chores because our job was to do as well as we could in school. And all of this was made possible, we think, in an era that sadly has gone the way of so many things that we no longer are able to do as a community. Have a family where the father was the primary breadwinner, the wife was a housewife, it wasn't unusual, or maybe worked part-time, but the fathers in the neighborhood, and right there was that was significant that we had men in the neighborhood, down the street, around the corner, to help look out for the children or the community as a whole.
Your mother was ahead of her time in terms of how she approached her two girls, and that was great. And I'm sure there was a great interaction between your father and your mother. Now, I didn't get your. I want to reverse it back because you talked about your father, Catherine. Now I want you to talk about your mother, and then I want you, Claudia, to talk about your father.
Our mother was very protective of us. We weren't, I won't say we were spoiled. Some people might have thought we were spoiled because of our concentration on academic endeavors. You wouldn't see us necessarily washing too many dishes, doing all that much cleaning up, except maybe making our beds, doing the minimum, because we had a bigger job to do in our mother's opinion, and that was the job of becoming educated and paying attention in school. And in fact, because the school was right across the street, she would come to the school often as a volunteer and too often to suit us. And I remember thinking, oh, here she is again. Why is she up here trying to see what we're doing? And it wasn't until many years later that I realized, yes, she was making sure that we did what we were supposed to do, but just as, if not more importantly, making certain that the teachers were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Because we were shielded, growing up in New York, we were somewhat shielded from the worst of racism, overt racism. And of course, the schools were segregated. But an interesting thing was that even though the children were all, except for we had a few little holdovers. Remember, I'm not going to mention their names, they may still be living. We had a few Italian families that still lived in the neighborhood, but for the most part, and again, I didn't find this out till many decades later, due to what is now known as blockbusting. As soon as some of us African Americans started coming to the neighborhood, suddenly changed overnight. Were the children were all African American, but the teachers were all white. And in fact, most of them were of a Jewish background. And our mother knew enough about the world, having been born in Mississippi, that they may not always have our best interests in heart. And I'm being very nice. So she wanted to make sure the teachers were giving their all to us. And that was the main reason, I believe, that she spent so much time up at the school. And then also as a surrogate for other parents who did not have the luxury of having the mother or the wife be at home. So it wasn't just us. It didn't just benefit the two of us that she would often come to the school. It benefited the other children too, whose parents worked or for whatever reason did not come up and monitor what was going on in the classroom as Daisy Thomas did. And Daisy Thomas would let you know if she thought you weren't doing what was required. You didn't want to be on the receiving end of that kind of a, can I call it, not so much a lecture, but that kind of sentiment.
Okay, Catherine, now, Claudia, now your father, from your point of
Just
view.
add, I have to pick up where Kathy left off because our principal, one of her worst nightmares was for the principal's assistant to say, Daisy Thomas is sitting outside of your office. And I remember a story of the principal refusing to come out for hours because Daisy Thomas was sitting outside of her office. And Daisy had something to say. When Kathy graduated sixth grade, and in those days you went from sixth grade to junior high school, she was the first person in the 30-something year history of that elementary school, PS 123 in Queens, New York, to pass the Hunter test and be admitted. Hunter College has a high school, a junior high, an elementary school, and it may have even had pre-K. But specialized schools in New York City were free, had excellent education above the regular public schools, and were admitted children by standards set by the tests they took for entry. Kathy had passed the test with flying colors and was slated to go to Hunter Junior High School, not the neighborhood school, and I will mention the name Shimer Junior High, which was a ghetto school, which had a reputation for kids getting their heads stuck down the toilet. That's all I remember. This is something I didn't want to happen to me, but it was a ghetto school with poor standards. Our principal in PS 123 decided to send Kathy's records to the neighborhood junior high, Shimer, instead of Hunter. We were in Queens, Hunter was in Manhattan. And why did she want to do that? And that's why Daisy Thomas was sitting outside of her office to stand over her until she corrected that error. Kathy was going to Hunter. I don't know when the next person passed the Hunter test. I didn't pass it. I was a year behind Kathy. I didn't pass it, but it was a challenging test. But Kathy had passed it, and she was supposed to go on to Hunter Junior High and Hunter High, and if she wanted, Hunter College. The principal had to be set straight on that particular issue. But
Okay,
as
now
far as our dad, excuse me,
I said, now your father.
our dad, he was the man. He was a man rarely without a smile. If he wasn't smiling, something was wrong. And I only recently realized that our father was an entrepreneur. As far as I knew, Daddy drove our father owned a cab that could haul tractor trailers. And that cab was his livelihood. And he would go into Long Island every day and hitch up a trailer, take it into Manhattan, have it unloaded, and go back to Long Island. This is what he did. So he was an owner operator of a business. Prior to that, he was a Pullman porter, a chef, as he said, in the big hotels, a chauffeur, a busboy, and a welder with skills so superior that it kept him out of the military, worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and would teach white men welding skills so they could be promoted. And where did he go? Stayed in his position to teach the next batch. Of course, they didn't promote him, but he was apparently a very skilled welder. And he was a working man. He did odd jobs and whatever it took to put change in his pocket. He was also a spiritual man.
Kelly, was
Uh,
he Jamaican?
no, he wasn't Jamaican, honey, but
I was just thinking of it in living color.
he wasn't Jamaican, but his father may have been. Charles Thomas Sr. apparently came somewhere from the West Indies, and that's the most information you get from Ancestry. We really need to go to a genealogist who can give us more than a green quarter of the map of Africa to say that's where we're from, because that's what you get if you're African American and you join Ancestry and want to find out where your people are from. And they don't say, oh, Gabon and some from Cote d'Ivoire. No, there's a big green area on the map of Africa where you from. But we found out that he was supposed to be West Indian. And even in Ancestry records now, they don't narrow it down to where from. But his father may have been Jamaican.
Look at it more carefully, because what you're just saying, I've discovered over the last month or so, because I actually wrote a play about my family history, and that was really not complete. But all of a sudden, I'm discovering that my great grandmother was born in Angola in 1764, and that on the other side, her son was born in Trinidad in 1798. And I'm looking at all this information, I'm saying, wow, this is really coming. Particularly if they're from the West Indians, what happens is that the British kept very good records. And now it links those records together, and that you can, all of a sudden, you're seeing some of the history of our history coming to life because we're in those records that the British kept in those islands. But anyway, I'm sorry. I just had to say that because I was excited. And when you see something, you say, oh, damn. But go ahead and finish. I'm sorry.
So Daddy may have had some Jamaican blood, but he had a hardworking spirit. And as I was about to say, he was a spiritual man. There was a church, a congregational church, also known as United Church of Christ, a few blocks from our home. And that's where we worshiped. Daddy was a deacon. Mommy sang in the choir. We went to church every Sunday. And as teenagers, we were given the liberty to go out Saturday night, come home whenever we wanted. Sometimes you could see the daylight coming in the sky and we just coming in the house. But we were going to church. Christian background started with Lemuel Haynes, Congregational Church. He was a very fair-skinned Black gentleman who I imagine was one of the former ministers. Kathy may know more. And as a little community with a little church, I remember Daddy was doing all kinds of jobs in the church. He and the pastor were laying concrete when the pastor had a heart attack and died. And he was very active in the church. And again, my mother sang in the choir. So he was a spiritual man. And we were a spiritual family. And we were taught by example. For example, I don't know what year it was, but my mother had a habit of always having the radio on. Just a radio. I think my sister has inherited it. The radio was always on, and it was even on during dinner. One night we were eating dinner as a family, and an announcement came on that an airplane was circling what was known then as Idlewild Airport and had lost its landing gear. Idlewild Airport was a few miles from our home, now known as Kennedy Airport. They didn't know how it was going to land, whether it would be a crash landing, whether it would be a terrible catastrophe. And Daddy stopped dinner and took us all into the living room. We held hands, got on our knees, and prayed for the people on that plane. And it's how you teach your children what it means to have faith. We prayed for those people on the plane, and we went back to finish dinner, and an announcement was made that the plane had landed safely on its belly.
was great.
spiritual leader of the household.
That was great. Now tell me something. First of all, I know that Claudia went to Hunter Junior High School. What junior high school did you go to?
Other way around. Catherine went to Hunter Junior High School.
Catherine. I'm sorry. Catherine went to that, but where did you go?
Was the first year of, did they call it open enrollment then, Kathy?
I don't recall, but that in essence, that's what it was, open enrollment or something akin to that.
The next year, when it was time for me to go to junior high, we had a choice of busing. You could bus your children out of the neighborhood, out of Jamaica, into Kew Gardens to attend a predominantly Jewish junior high, which was better academically than Shimer, reportedly. And that's where I ended up going to school. You
Okay.
were separated by class
I'm
according to
sorry.
you were separated by class according to your records. So there was SP Special Progress, and that's where I was assigned. And it was S1, S2, and by the time you got to S14, you might as well call that special ed. By going to Russell Sage Junior High, it was the first time I was introduced to a significant number of white children and Jewish children and Italian children and all sorts of diversity as far as Caucasians were concerned. And these are the people I went to school with.
Okay, now, where did you go? Where did you, Catherine, go to high school at, and where did you go, Claudia, to high school? Did y'all go to the same high school or still separated?
No, I was still in Hunter. Hunter took you all the way up to graduation from high school.
Okay, and Claudia, where did you go?
Went to the High School of Music and Art in Harlem.
What was the rivalry between the two of y'all going to different schools?
There was no rivalry. We both had to take the subway
Uh-huh.
and then go out of our neighborhood. But there was no rivalry. There was a different orientation. My sister was always book smart, much more so than I. And Hunter was, how can I say?
An elite
I think
school.
it was challenging academically. And she breezed through that much more easily than I would have. I, on the other hand, was artistic. And it was our mother, I'm sure, who researched the specialized schools in New York City, Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, the other Hunter, and many more that I'm missing. But the High School of Music and Art, known as the Fame School, this is the school that was featured in the film Fame, was not only designed for children who were talented artistically and musically, but you had to have high academic standards. I think you had to have an 85 average to get in. So it was academically challenging, but I got to delve into my art. I loved art.
Now, you all graduated from high school. Where did you go to? Because I'm getting to the fun part, the rabble-rousing side. Catherine, you go to college where?
City College of New York, right there in Harlem. In fact, it was the neighbor of Music and Art.
Oh, so you all both went, you were able to travel together, but you just had to go different places when you went to college.
Not exactly, but for the first year until Claudia graduated from Music and Art, we were both going to Harlem, but I don't remember us riding the train together so much. Did we ride the train together, Claudia?
No, but we had different schedules. I don't know if you got off at the same stop than I did. I got off at 125th Street and then walked up the hill because St. Nicholas Terrace. But
And you went to Convent Avenue.
Say again?
You went to Convent Avenue. That's where CC.
Yes.
Yeah, you went
Yes,
to Convent.
my sister, being in college, she wouldn't want to be hanging out with some little high school kid, even though we were only 15 months apart. Socially, she had a different lifestyle. She had different friends and probably at times didn't even want to be seen with me. But I was still in high school, in public school. that
Okay.
first year of Kathy's CCNY experience.
So tell me, Catherine, about your experiences at CCNY.
I had been in school, as had Claudia, with mainly white children, I guess all of my junior high school education. But what happened at City College, maybe not the first year, but by the second year, when political consciousness was sweeping the country, City College was no exception. And that's where I had my political awakening, baptism, so to speak, with everything going on. College students were getting involved, as were we. And we were one of the many that ended up either the year before school had their political uprising. It might have been the year before. And had one of many campus uprisings. The big thing back then was the Vietnam War that was being protested, with white and black kids were against the Vietnam War and had protested accordingly. Then Black Power was ushered in, and that opened up a whole new avenue of consciousness that demanded action. At City College, here we were in the middle of Harlem, a black neighborhood, but a very small percentage back then, very small percentage of Harlem residents or black people in general were in City College. City College, even though it was a so-called city school, a subway school, it was part of the City University of New York, which was still held in high esteem. We had CCNY, Brooklyn College, Queens College, all of these schools, although they weren't live-in campuses, were very competitive and very good schools. Consequently, very few blacks were in that environment. Those schools, again, they were free, but adhered to high academic standards, so not just anyone could go. And we recognized that contradiction and we protested as a result, and ultimately did gain some concessions as a result of our protests.
How involved were you?
We did have a takeover, as many of the other schools you'll hear about what happened with Claudia at Vassar. We had a takeover of our own. And the significant thing to me about the takeover, similar to the Vassar takeover, is it was done quietly. Once the powers that be knew about it, it was happening. So
But I
we were
still ask
able
you,
to
how
meet.
involved were you personally?
Oh, I was involved with everybody else. I can't say I was one of the big leaders or it to the extent we even had so-called leaders because it was a large school. But I think that I was involved in terms of being part of what was part of a plan, part of a group that decided to do something and did it, where it was shown that you did not necessarily have to be part of a leadership team to have an impact. And that stayed with me a long time from City College because I hated to hear people say, Black people can't work together because I knew that they could, because we had.
Now, Claudia, I was contrasting, at least from what I read, and I did read part of your book. I haven't read the whole thing, but you went to Vassar because your sister just told the audience that you went to Vassar. But you were part of the leadership of that movement at Vassar at that time, were you not?
Not when I got there. I had to undergo a metamorphosis. Uh, First of all, let me tell you a little academic story that dates back to the fourth grade. I had started to show a talent for math by the fourth grade. And one day I came home with a 99 on a math test. I was so excited. And I showed my mom, and she said, "That's good, baby. Show it to your daddy when he gets home." Now, math was one of our father's strengths. He kept the records. He kept all his papers in a strong box that was in the hamper, and he took care of the finances in the home. And I guess some of that had rubbed off on me. I had this 99 in math, and I showed it to Daddy. And as we said, Daddy was usually jovial. He wrinkled his brow and looked at that paper and said, "What happened to the other point?" I was crushed. But both he and our mother had high expectations for their children. And because that was his expectation, I learned to get hundreds in math. There is no reason you can't get hundreds in maths. It's all very objective. It is or it isn't. And there's no one saying, I think you could have worded your essay better. So you get a B or a C. There's none of that is right or wrong. And if you can work the formulas and the rules of math has rules. If you care to. I love math because I like problem solving. I figured this out as an older adult. And I went on to junior high and high school and still getting hundreds in math, loving geometry, taking solid geometry at Boys High, another specialized school in New York, because they didn't offer it at music and art. Because I love geometry so much, I wanted some more of it. So this may sound very nerdy to you people who are listening, but look at who I am now. And a lot of that has to do with math and science. You don't become a surgeon.
Now?
Say that if you have to be nerdy to enter a specialty that is really an excellent specialty, if you want to become an astronaut, you got to be a nerd to some degree. But all of that to say that my academics were good, because of mommy giving us a head start, which she did. Our reading and our English are good. Our writing is good. And I got into Vasser College. Once somebody told me it was a school named Vasser that was just upstate New York, and that it was a good academic school. Also, National Merit Scholarships and Regents Scholarships from New York helped to pay the tuition. So when I got a Regents Scholarship, then it steered me towards schools in New York State because it would apply to schools in New York State. I got into Vassar in 1967, and I made myself over. I was going to be a different person because I guess the nerdiness never got over that well and I wasn't all that popular in any of my circles that I had roamed in to date. So I got a fall. I had long, straight hair, wore that fall and thought it looked good, and had other changes that I thought were cool for me. We wore dresses to dinner, and so I was dressed up in the evenings at school. And I got a white friend because there weren't many Black women at Vassar to associate with. So I had a little white friend, Anne. I think that was her name. I probably shouldn't tell her name anyway. And I was fitting right in to this predominantly white school until Anne and I were sitting in the TV room and the announcement came on that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And my eyes welled with tears. I looked at her. She wasn't even red. She was a very fair-skinned redhead. Wasn't even red. No emotion. Nothing to her. That's when I woke up. I realized that these people I had been trying to hang with knew nothing of my culture, had experienced none of my experience, none of my things. That Martin Luther King, Malcolm X were not even in their vocabulary. And I started hanging out with the few Black people who were on campus.
And then eventually you became the president of what organization?
Students Afro-American Society, SAS.
And were they part of the taking over of Vassar?
Yes, sir.
So you were a leader. You remind me of a friend of mine who father told the story. And they were in Mississippi. Her father was a chemistry professor at Jackson State and a leader of the Black community in that region, one of the leaders. And he was told about this gang, that they needed to get rid of this gang because they just disrupting. And then somebody said, but professor, your son is the leader of it. And the gang was what you was doing at Vassar. Carlton was trying to improve the station of blacks in the high schools where he went to. But he was called a gang leader. So you were a gang leader academically.
During the civil rights movement, as Kathy explained to you, and I became more aware through the other sisters, few as we were, but through the other sisters at Vassar. And we began to look around and see that Vassar was not addressing our needs. We didn't have any Black Studies courses. We didn't have a Black Studies department. We began to feel that these were things we needed, and got to a point where the school had established a Black Studies department and even chosen a leader, allowed us to choose a leader, actually, who was the first director of Black Studies at Vasser College. This was all well and good on paper, but there was no longevity associated with the Black Studies department or the Black Studies courses. There was no Black Studies major. There was no Black Studies degree. And there were other deficiencies with respect to African American history. We were isolated on this campus. My class had the largest number of Black students that Vassar had ever admitted, which was 6 in a class of, I think, over 100 students. And this was one of the deficiencies, the number of students of color who were being admitted to the college. So the Students Afro-American Society came up with a list of demands. There were 9 demands, and they were written on my typewriter. I know the font of the typewriter I was using in college, and submitted to the administration. We met with the administration, we met with the president, and expressed our concerns. And we were ignored. So we said, we have to get their attention. So one fall Saturday, we had a march from Kendrick House. We did have a Black house. They had given us a Black house, very nice building. And we walked down to the Alumni House, which was less than a mile, with this pillowcase that myself and another student who was artistic had shaped into the image of a pig. So we had his little head tied off. We had I think, a can for his snout and little arms and legs. And we took the pig, who was stuffed with leaves, fall leaves, down to the Alumni House. And it was labeled the administration. We set it in a fountain that generally held flowers at the foot of the Alumni House and set it on fire. So we were burning the administration in effigy and calling them pigs. We got no response to our demand after that. It was then determined it's time to do something drastic. That was a vague term, but we knew we were going to do something drastic. And I have to admit that the spunk and fire of our mother probably inspired me to get involved in whatever we were going to do. The SAS met. We reviewed the importance of our demands to us, and agreed that the college had not responded in any kind of way that they were taking us seriously, and agreed that we would form a small committee that would determine what that drastic action would be and plan that next action. And the majority of the people in the room had no idea what that would be, but agreed that they would take part. I dare you to find that degree of participation, blind participation, in today's society. But there were 34 or so young ladies who decided to meet at a certain place in the campus, 3 o'clock in the morning, on October 30th, 1969. When we met, our small committee had gathered ropes, hoses, lumber, nails, and we shut that place down. The administration building, the working part of it was on the first floor. It was a limited space, and each door had been studied to see how we had to secure that door so that no one could get inside. We dismissed the switchboard operator after having her give a tutorial to one of our senior students. There were seniors in there taking over this building who had the most to lose. She gave instruction to the senior student, took her up to the next floor on the elevator, and then brought the elevator back down to the first floor and locked it. And we had ourselves snugged into that main administration building of Vasser College and waited. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, we had the switchboard. No cell phones, not even phones in the president's home. Working, had to come through the switchboard. So the switchboard was a strategic place that had been occupied. It made the papers, it made walls of concrete. It was all over that we had occupied the main building of Vasser College. And this being an elite white school, Jane Fonda, Jacqueline Kennedy, what?
Don't forget about Merrill.
She was my class. But Meryl Streep was in my class. And I'm just telling you the kind of people who graduate from Vassar. This was an elite school. And these little niggas were sitting up in there occupying the main building. The rest is in my book. Again, my autobiography is called God Spare Life. And it tells you how it went.
Now, when you heard about this, Catherine, what were you thinking? And what were your parents thinking?
That was the big thing, not knowing how parents would actually react. And in fact, I remember when I was in college, being so enamored of organizations like the Black Panther Party, but knowing I better not even think about joining because that would be the end. Remember your story, Claudia? The end for you. That would have been
when I was
the
about
end for
5 years
me.
old.
That would have been the end. But that was it. This was not in a vacuum. The takeover of Vassar, City College, any other number of schools was not in a vacuum. This is what the spirit of the country was, the tenor of the times, and it was unstoppable. And the sooner that the powers that be realized that we were on the wave of history, then the sooner we could gain some equity in whatever endeavor we were pursuing.
How did
Mommy
your
called up.
parents? What did your parents say? Especially to you, Claudia.
Mommy called up. And I spoke to her on the phone. And she said, there's nobody who's worth their salt who hasn't gone to jail for civil disobedience.
That's great.
She was proud.
That was great. Now, although I want to get further into your life, I do have to ask you this current situation with what you all did back in the late 60s in terms of opening up certain things, particularly the DEI of the time. How are you looking at what's happening today? Whichever one want to start.
We see that things that we heard all of our lives or heard as young people are true. Life is cyclical. And what happened back then, you better learn from it because it's going to happen again. Back then, it was called this DEI. I didn't know what they were talking about until maybe a couple of weeks ago. Nothing but affirmative action, what we used to call affirmative action, something that was to try, because you never could do it completely, try to make things right in terms of the fact that we as African Americans had been denied, let's say in our situation, entry to schools, to higher education that we were worthy of, not because we could not do the work, but because we had not been given the opportunity. So those opportunities were finally made available. And then what did you have? One of the biggest protests that I participated in was the slew of cases going to the Supreme Court finally ending at the Supreme Court to dismantle affirmative action, like the Bakke case. I don't know if you all remembered it, but it was relevant because it was the University of California, which is a big statewide institution that charged so-called revert, and I'm gonna say so-called because I don't believe there's any such thing when it comes to African Americans, so-called reverse discrimination. They were beat back. I remember marching and saying, beat back the Bakke decision. This was the decision in California that did declare that so-called preferential admissions were discriminatory toward white people. So our mantra was to beat back the Bakke decision, and it was beaten back. However, now we're looking at 50 years later, and I dare say that if it were before the Supreme Court now, as other decisions have been creeping along to turn back the tide of the strides that have been made to dismantle discrimination, you would see another outcome. And that's what we're looking at. And it's sad. It lets you know you still have to fight. You may not feel like it. You may be considered a senior citizen or an elder, but in order to keep things from reversing, we have to still remain vigilant. The year I went into law school, 1973, was the year that Roe v. Wade was founded. Now, some of us as Black people aren't as up in arms as white people for various reasons, founded reasons. But however, I would say most African Americans would support Roe v. Wade. Now it's been reversed. And what does that mean for the African community? Maybe not as much as it means for the white community, because we have always, I won't go into a dissertation on what I think about that, but it's just an example of how 50 years can turn the tide of what progress was being made. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, codified separate but equal.
Now, let me stop
That
you here.
was
Let me stop you here for a minute. I want you to go on, and I want you to talk, Claudia, but I want the audience to get the context in terms of what you're talking about from your qualifications. Where did you go to law school at?
George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
One of the best law schools in the country, right?
Yes, according to white people.
Okay.
And I'm grateful to have had a chance to go there. I don't mean it disparagingly, but
Okay.
it had its flaws as
But
well.
I want the audience to know that when you're talking from a position of strength, at least how white people judge the law school credentials of someone. Okay, go on.
I won't say I lost my train of thought, but Plessy versus Ferguson, it took 50 years. And isn't that ironic? These things seem to happen in several decades worth of time to reverse Plessy versus Ferguson, which made separate but equal legal, to get to Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that separate was inherently unequal. 50 years to reverse that travesty. And now here we are 50 years after many of our affirmative action decisions were rendered, going in the opposite direction, books being banned. Can you imagine Alice Walker being banned and other of our renowned award-winning authors being banned because they might make white people feel some kind of way, as the youngsters would say? We won't even talk about Claudia's now home state of Florida and the craziness. And I can chuckle, but it's certainly not funny because you see the clock ticking backwards right in front of your face. And it's amazing that this is being allowed to occur.
Now, Claudia, in I wanted to also ask you in particular how you feel having gone through what you've gone through, but I want to do it in a matter of some of the experiences that you had after college, what some of the things that you have done and how it relates to what's happening now.
Let me say that the takeover, I'll take you back there, was a success.
Okay.
Our 9 demands were granted after the college called in the trustees. These are the ones with the money. So they wanted to know, Vasser wanted to know, what do we do? We got Black students protesting. They locked us out of the administration building. One of those trustees actually led a demonstration and an occupation a couple of years after our incident. But the trustees were on the liberal side. They said, we feel these demands are fair. They should be granted with amnesty, which was huge because, as I said, some of the students in there were seniors. This was the fall of their senior year. Had the college decided to suspend us for our disobedience, it would have been tragic. We got our Black Studies department. My love for math waned. I went into Vassar as a math major, thought I was going to have some more geometry. Differential equations and real analysis just floated above my head. And I decided that math was no longer the problem solving major that I loved. And I switched my major to Black Studies. I was able to do that because we now had a Black Studies department that could grant a degree because of the takeover. I also switched to pre-med, which was not a major, but I did a study on sickle cell anemia statistics in the Poughkeepsie, New York community where Vassar was located as my senior thesis. So that's how I combined Black Studies and medicine. This allowed me to apply to medical school. I got into Johns Hopkins. And as you asked Kathy, what about Beth? Well, we have an running argument with Harvard as to which is the best medical school in the country. But Johns Hopkins ain't no slouch. A student at Johns Hopkins, I was exposed to a specialty that is very rare for women, which is orthopedic surgery. I pursued it and was accepted at Yale to become the first woman to train in orthopedics at Yale. I would have been the first woman anywhere I applied. I got into this specialty, started my training, and had already noticed, but it became even more relevant, that there were no women. There were a handful of women in the country out of thousands of orthopedic surgeons who were practicing this in this field. And so when I finished training, I joined the faculty of Johns Hopkins as assistant professor and decided I was going to change the face of orthopedics. When I found out at the termination of my training in 1980 as a resident that I was the first Black woman, because I didn't go carrying the torch, I'm going to be the first. I had no idea. I found that I was the first Black woman. I said, I won't be the last. When I was on the faculty at Hopkins, I began to change the face. And this answers your DEI question, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a different package if you ask the master to let you in. Oh, master, I'm so good. Can I become one of your students? When approached that way, master can say, sure, and he can kick your ass out whenever he's ready. My DEI plan for the Johns Hopkins University orthopedic program, which had graduated, I don't know how many decades it had been in existence, had graduated, I think, 1 or 2 women in its 50-year history and had graduated 1 or 2 Black people in its history, needed to change. So how did I do that? We have 5 spots a year that we award to people who come into Hopkins and start their orthopedic training and get their orthopedic degree from the prestigious Johns Hopkins University. For those 5 spots, we had around 600 applicants each year. Somebody's got to go through the records. You have to go through the applications. It's tedious. Nobody wants to do this. But I volunteered to help sort through the records. And when I saw an applicant who was a person of color, who had the same or better credentials than the one I knew we were training right now, I recommended an interview. Because you see, it's not a matter of preference. It's not a matter of let some dumbass take a position that they don't deserve. It's a matter of opportunity. And if you never get the opportunity to even apply for that program, then how are you going to show up? I told you Hopkins had a scattered history of how many women and people of color it had trained in its 50-year history. When I left the faculty of Hopkins some 12 years later, 20% of the residents in training, again, that's 5 a class for 5 years, 20% of the residents in training were female, 2% were African American. That's how you make a change. Wish and so. That's how you make a change. You got to get involved, not beg the master to give you a piece of bread, but see people who qualify, see people who've been overlooked, and put them in the front. And tell your colleagues, why would you not accept this person to train at Johns Hopkins in orthopedics?
When did you leave Johns Hopkins?
Johns Hopkins twice. Left Johns Hopkins in, let me get it right. I got married somewhere, which was a miracle, somewhere in there in 1985. And I left Johns Hopkins in 1986 and moved to St. Thomas and started a private practice. And then I had some personal tragedies that brought me back to the States. God intervened, and you would never know that I was a person who was as sick as I was. And I was healed and got back on the staff of Johns Hopkins in 1991 and stayed until 4 when I came to Florida. It was during that period that I changed the face of orthopedics and brought diversity, if you will, a word that I don't use much, diversity to the orthopedic training program.
Now, Catherine, you practiced law for some time. Talk just a little bit about your law career, and then you moved on to another career.
I've always been somewhat of had a rebellious, or to put it in a better frame of mind, an independent streak. I could never, and sometimes I've regretted taking such a stance, but it is what it is, or was what it was. Did not like the idea or felt comfortable with the idea of having a whole bunch of bosses. I like being independent. During my rebellious years, I had developed somewhat of a sense of distrust for certain aspects of the government. So no one was ever, to give a wild example, going to say, talk me into coming to work for the FBI or similar institutions. So I spent most of my time, to make a long story short, working independently and as a sole practitioner, primarily, where I felt I could have the most impact on helping individual people, a learning as you go situation. If they needed a family practitioner, that's what I became for them, because thankfully I had the ability to do so and to be of assistance. There were times when I did flirt with going into the government, since after all, I had remained in Washington, D.C. I did not head back to New York after graduation. But back, and it's hard to believe we're talking 40 to 50 years ago, back then the doors were not quite as open as they were now, during the times when I did decide maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing to work for the EEO, for example, Equal Opportunity Commission, which was created in later years. It was one of your newer government programs. But again, the when I decided to give those types of opportunities a try, there I still found doors closed, and found out later on that what I had taken for granted was considered elitist and had some of the same flaws that your big law firms had, and even within the government. So I continued on with what I was doing, but I had always, and I can't even remember, maybe it was inherited from daddy, but I always, again, liked the idea of independence, becoming a business person, having a big impact. And that led me to various things that I did in that regard. One of them was I always had been, not always, but I began to see the connection between US African Americans and Africa as a strong one that should be exploited, not in a bad way, but in a good way, could be exploited more than it had been. And the fact that we, meaning African Americans, didn't suffer everything that we had suffered for naught. There had to be a way for us to make a connection back to the motherland in a way that would benefit us as a people. We were here, brought over in chains, given terrible treatment, but by being so close to the so-called master, we gained skills and technology and different aspects of so-called modern life that could be shared with our African brothers and sisters. And I guess that was somewhat of an idealistic stance, because many of the countries that I did major in history, but I don't want to go into a big history lesson as to what the issues and factors were that kept Africa so impoverished. Most of it was colonialism, neo-colonialism, whatever you want to call it. But then there's other parts of it that led to the breeding of corruption and the inability of whatever leadership there was to make the best of the natural resources. But that was one of my major loves, was trying to forge that link in in an economic way, not just in a cultural way, although, of course, in a cultural way as well, but in an economic way. So that was one of the things that I pursued. And there were others as well, such as broadcasting. I was and still am. I'm not actively involved on the radio, but for many years active in broadcasting with the Pacifica Foundation. That was not something that led to paid position, but, and I'm sure Claudia remembers this, I did try to acquire, at some point they were giving out, and when I say giving out, I don't mean for free, but licenses were being made available in broadcasting. And we actually put our resources together to acquire the right to build a broadcast medium in the USVI where Claudia was living. So it seemed like something that was doable. To shorten the story somewhat,
Too late.
yeah, too late. There were things outside of just the straight practice of law that interested me, and more than doing that. And that's what led me to other endeavors, including what I'm doing now, which is real estate. And that's enough for now. You get an idea of what has led me to the path that I'm on. And all during this time, I've always had an Afrocentric view of the world and my place within it. I'm not just here for me. I'm here in order to assist in the resurrection of our people from a spiritual, cultural, and economic sense.
And finally, Claudia.
Just wanted to add to Kathy that she has maintained an international focus, even with real estate.
Yes.
Claudia, in closing, what are some of the things that you are doing now and want to focus on?
I have always been a mentor. I remember tutoring children not that much younger than I in elementary school. Mentoring has become a stronghold since I became the first Black female orthopedic surgeon in history. My goal has been to get that number up, not only for Black females, but for Black men and for white females. Orthopedic surgery is the most exclusive form of medicine that you can practice. It's predominantly practiced by white males who may be 6'4" or bigger, ex-football players, that type. But there is a higher percentage of women and people of color who are urologists, who are neurosurgeons, and other, I would describe it as obscure specialties of medicine. So my goal has been to get myself out there. I used to do a lot of speaking engagements before COVID. I don't travel anymore because of the dangers. To let people know that this little Black girl turned out to be something that wasn't before. And just because something hasn't been done before or hasn't been done often doesn't mean you can't do it.
Amen.
As of this year, there are over 100 Black women who are orthopedic surgeons. That, to me, is a goal that I have achieved. They all know who I am. They all quote me. They follow me. And this is what I've done by being me and not by taking my candy and going home, but by making myself visible and accessible to other young ladies who may not have thought of this, may not have thought of surgery. When I moved to Florida in 2004 to join a practice, an orthopedic practice run by one of my mentees, whom I had inspired to go into orthopedics. He begged me to come down here and join him in practice, and I did. Shortly after that, I started a mentoring group because our group that I joined at that time started to grow. And before I knew it, we were 6 African American orthopedic surgeons in private practice in Florida. Now, what an image is that for a little kid to see? And I said, we need to start a mentoring group. We started a mentoring group for 40 boys in middle school. We met every month and then later every week. And when they came to that meeting, they knew they were going to see 6 Black surgeons in scrubs, not standing on the street corner, not trying to get you to sell something in the package and get arrested, not part of a gang, but orthopedic surgeons.
So let me just say, that's it for the show about stuff. Join us next week for another wonderful topic, and I thank the Thomas sisters for being with me. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. You're more than welcome. Our pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed this show about stuff. See you next time.